jump right in. Today we're going deep on the Russia-Ukraine situation. And, well, things are getting pretty interesting. There's a lot of buzz about a possible peace plan. And at the same time, we're seeing some big shifts on the battlefield.
Yeah, definitely keeping things pretty dynamic, wouldn't you say?
Totally.
Yeah.
So the source we're diving into today is this blog post from Simplicious's Garden of Knowledge. It's called Velika Novosilka Falls Without Fight, as 100-day peace plan reportedly leaked.
Catchy title, right?
Oh, for sure. Simplicious always knows how to grab your attention.
Oh, absolutely. But before we even get to this whole peace plan thing, we need to talk about what's happening on the ground, because things have taken a pretty sharp turn.
Yeah, no doubt about that. The blog post points out that a bunch of Ukrainian strongholds have fallen. And the speed is, well, I have to say it's a little alarming. Places like Seladov, Korakov, Ugledar, these were names we all heard about earlier in the conflict, right? Long, drawn-out battles.
Exactly. I remember thinking at the time, this is going to be a slog. Yeah, and now Velika Novosilka falls without much of a fight. It really makes you wonder what's going on.
I know, right? Is this a sign that Ukraine is just falling apart? Or are they pulling back strategically?
Right.
Trying to regroup?
Tough to say for sure. I mean, Simplicious doesn't really give a clear answer, but he does point to some things that could be at play.
Like what?
Well, he mentions reports of heavy Ukrainian casualties, and then there's the whole mobilization effort. There are rumors that it's hitting some roadblocks, and of course there's the constant drone strikes from Russia. They're definitely taking a toll.
Yeah, you can't underestimate the impact of those drones. It's got to be demoralizing, facing that kind of relentless attack.
So if this trend keeps up, I mean, what does it mean for the overall war? We've got the battle for Pokrovsk coming up. Could we see the same thing happen there?
I'd say it's a real possibility. And then there's this detail in the blog post that really jumped out at me about this bridgehead that Russia has established west of the Oskol River. Okay, I remember reading about that, but I'm not sure I fully grasped the significance. What's the big deal with this bridgehead?
Well, think about it this way. It gives Russia a secure position on the other side of the river, right? Which makes it way harder for Ukraine to defend. And not only that, it potentially opens up a path towards Kupiansk.
Kupiansk. Okay, yeah. Now I'm seeing why that's a big deal. Isn't that a strategically important city for Ukraine?
It's vital. If Russia gets control of Kupiansk, it would be a huge blow to Ukraine's defenses in the northeast. Plus, it would put them in a prime position to launch even more offensives.
So basically, things are looking pretty shaky for Ukraine right now.
To put it mildly.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of, Russia making these rapid advances. And then, just to make things even more complicated, we had this whole leaked peace plan thing floating around. Where did this even come from?
Well, Simplicious points to a report from Strana, a Ukrainian news outlet. They're the ones claiming to have the inside scoop on this peace plan. It's supposedly coming from Trump's camp. And the timeline is, well, let's just say it's ambitious. A ceasefire by April, and a full armistice by May 2025.
Wow, that's moving fast. But what's actually in this plan? What are they proposing?
Okay, so first of all, it calls for direct talks between Trump and Putin, and maybe even a three-way meeting with Zelensky on top of that. Then there's the whole staged ceasefire thing, prisoner exchanges, guarantees of Ukrainian neutrality, the usual stuff.
Okay, I've heard those ideas before.
Yeah.
But is there anything, surprising in this plan?
Oh, yeah, definitely. For example, there's this proposal for Ukraine to join the EU by 2030. And get this, the U.S. would modernize the Ukrainian army.
Hold on a second. Did I hear that right? Ukraine would stay neutral, but the U.S. would beef up their military. Doesn't that seem kind of, I don't know, contradictory?
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows. I mean, on the surface, this plan tries to tackle some of the big issues that have been fueling this whole conflict. But the big question is, how likely is it that both sides would actually agree to these terms? And what are the potential sticking points that could blow the whole thing up?
Simplicious definitely seems skeptical. He questions whether this plan is even legit. And he points to one thing that could be a major deal breaker, this whole idea of Ukraine keeping and modernizing its army.
Yeah, I mean, put yourself in Russia's shoes. They've taken heavy losses, they've got security concerns, and now they're supposed to be okay with a modernized, well-equipped Ukrainian army right on their border. I don't think so.
Especially after those recent Ukrainian attacks on Russian strategic assets, right? Those attacks on the 295 bases, the early warning systems Ukraine showed they can hit back, even without a huge standing army.
Exactly. So any deal that doesn't address that threat, that fear, it's probably a non-starter for Russia. They've put way too much into this conflict to just back down and leave themselves vulnerable.
So even if Ukraine says, okay, we'll be neutral, which is a huge concession, right? it might not be enough to satisfy Russia. Now, what a mess.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And then you have to consider the internal politics on both sides, too. In Ukraine, Zelensky's under pressure. He's getting criticized for how he's handling the war, especially now that things are looking bad. And in Russia, you have these hardliners who want a total victory, no compromises.
So it's like they're stuck. Any concession they make could look like weakness. And that could lead to, I don't know, maybe even a coup or something.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high. And then there's that whole wild card of European unity, or the lack of it. If that support for Ukraine starts to crumble, it could give Russia the green light to push even harder.
Right, because they'll figure the West doesn't have the stomach for a long fight.
Oh.
It's like that example Simplicius brings up about Nigel Farage's Reform UK party topping the polls in the UK. It's a sign that things are shifting, that maybe Europe isn't as united as it used to be.
For sure. And that could have huge implications for how this whole conflict plays out.
So we've got this potential peace plan. But at the same time, you have these voices in Russia saying they're on the verge of winning and they get to dictate the terms. It's a pretty volatile mix.
Volatile is an understatement. It's like a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And this is where Colonel Marcus Reisner's analysis comes in. He's the Austrian military guy that Simplicius quotes. And Reisner actually thinks time is on Russia's side.
Wait, really? But what about Russia's economy? Aren't the sanctions hurting them?
They are, but Reisner's argument is that Russia can handle it. They've always been willing to endure hardship, to play the long game. And then there's the psychological aspect. Simplicius quotes this Russian analyst, Starsha Edda. Edda basically says this whole peace plan is a fantasy. He thinks Russia will only agree to peace after they've won, on their own terms.
So you have this potential peace plan floating around. But at the same time, you have these people in Russia who think they're about to win and they don't need to negotiate. It's like, man, it's hard to even wrap your head around it.
It is. It's a lot to process. And then you have Colonel Reisner saying that Russia might be close to some major breakthroughs, that this whole thing could escalate even further.
Okay, now I'm really getting worried. What does he mean by breakthroughs exactly?
He's talking about a shift to what he calls operational level warfare. Basically, it means Russia's moving from these smaller tactical battles to going after bigger strategic objectives. They're looking for those game-changing moves that could swing the whole war in their favor.
So if Reisner's right, and Russia does pull off these big moves, could that make these peace negotiations totally irrelevant?
It's definitely possible. And you can see why this peace plan, with its specific dates for a ceasefire and an armistice, might be seen as a way to hit pause, you know, to try and stop things from getting even worse. But whether that's realistic, given how things are going and how much distrust there is, well, that's another question entirely.
And on top of all that, you have this other layer of complexity. European unity or the lack of it.
Right, that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. This whole war has been a huge shock to Europe, politically and economically. And there are signs that the unity that's been so important for Ukraine, it might be starting to crack.
Yeah, Simplicius brings up that example about Nigel Farage's Reform UK party leading the polls.
Yeah.
That suggests a real shift in the UK towards a more isolationist stance. And if other European countries start following suit, man, that could be really bad news for Ukraine.
Absolutely. It could leave them isolated, vulnerable, especially as the conflict drags on and the economic pain gets worse. It's like this whole house of cards, and if one card gets pulled.
The whole thing could come crashing down. So to sum it all up, we've got Russia making gains, a peace plan that nobody's sure about, and this big question mark over whether Europe can stay united. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it's all happening so fast. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. But one thing's for sure. This situation is incredibly dynamic, and things could change dramatically at any moment.
It's enough to make your head spin, but that's why we're here, right? To try and make sense of it all.
Exactly. We'll be diving deeper into the nitty-gritty of this whole situation in the next part. And we'll talk about what it means for, the average person trying to understand what's going on in the world.
So make sure you stick around for part 2. We're going to back all the complexities and try to figure out what's next.
It's going to be a wild ride.
You can say that again. All right, we'll be right back after a short break.
It's like, as we dig into all this, about the peace plan and what Simplicius is saying, it's clear that Russia's really anxious. Yeah. I mean, it goes way beyond just NATO expansion.
Yeah, and Simplicius makes a really good point when he says, even if you demilitarize Ukraine, they could still be a threat to Russia, especially after they hit those strategic targets.
It's like David and Goliath. Even without a huge army, Ukraine showed they could do some serious damage. Think about those attacks on the 295 bases. Their early warning systems. They really made their point. Exactly. And that's why Russia won't accept any deal that doesn't deal with that threat, that deep-seated fear. I mean, they've put so much into this war, they're not going to back down and leave themselves open to more attacks.
So even if Ukraine agrees to neutrality, which is a huge step back for them, it might not even be enough for Russia to feel safe. It makes you wonder what a real solution would even look like.
It's a tough one for sure. And then you have to think about the politics in both countries. Zelensky's getting heat for how he's handling the war, especially now that things are going south. And in Russia, you've got those hardliners who want a total victory. No compromises.
So they're both kind of trapped,
Probably.
right? Anything they give up could make them look weak. And that could lead to who knows what, maybe even a coup.
Yeah, the stakes are unbelievably high. And then you throw in the whole question of European unity, or really the lack of it. If that support for Ukraine starts to fade, it could embolden Russia to push even harder.
Yeah. Because they'll think the West is getting cold feet. It's like that example Simplicius uses with Nigel Farage's Reform UK party leading the polls. It shows that things are changing. Maybe Europe isn't as united as it was.
Definitely. And that could have a massive impact on the whole conflict.
It's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitics and the military strategies. But we can't forget that there are real people at the heart of this. The blog post had some pretty intense videos of the casualties and the destruction.
Yeah, it's a harsh reminder that behind all the analysis and speculation, there are real people suffering and dying. We have to remember that when we talk about peace, about finding a solution.
I think it's safe to say most of us just want this to end peacefully. But with so many things going on, so many potential problems, it's hard to feel optimistic.
Uncertainty is definitely the name of the game right now. But here's what we do know. The decisions made in the next few weeks and months will have huge consequences, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the whole world.
That's a heavy thought. It
Yeah.
sounds like we're at a real turning point, a make-or-break moment.
We are. And that's why it's more important than ever to stay informed, to really engage with these issues, and to question our own assumptions.
So let's bring this back to our listeners.
Yeah.
What should they be taking away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no easy answers here. It's incredibly complicated and it's changing all the time.
But that doesn't mean we should just ignore it.
Absolutely
Yeah.
not. This is a time for active listening, critical thinking, and informed engagement.
So we need to stay informed, challenge our own biases, and be willing to have those tough conversations. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us do that, we can start to find a way out of this mess.
Now you're talking. Remember, knowledge is power, especially now.
Well said. Well, I don't know about you, but all this talk about war and peace is kind of wearing me down. Maybe we need a change of pace.
Yeah, I'm with you. Some fresh air and a little perspective would do us all good.
You know, it's amazing how this whole thing is unfolding. We've got these peace talks happening, but at the same time, the war is still raging. It's like they're playing chess with real lives.
It really is, and it shows how we can't just focus on one thing at a time. The military situation, the politics, the economics, the human cost, it's all connected. It's all part of this huge puzzle.
One thing that really stuck with me from Simplicius's blog post was that argument about time being on Russia's side. Like Colonel Reisner's idea about operational level warfare and those big breakthroughs he talked about, it's kind of scary, to be honest.
Reisner's definitely got people talking, and if he's right, it puts a lot of pressure on Ukraine to get a deal done quickly before things get even worse for them.
But even if this peace plan is legit, there's still that big question. Would Russia even go for it? Especially that part about Ukraine keeping its army and making it stronger.
Yeah, that's the big sticking point. As we talked about before, Russia sees a strong Ukrainian military as a huge threat. And I can't see them backing down on that. They've put too much on the line to just accept a situation where Ukraine could still be a problem for them.
So even if this plan is a real attempt to make peace, it sounds like it needs some serious work. Both sides would have to give up a lot. And I'm not sure either of them is willing to do that.
That's a key point. Peace isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's about fixing the things that caused the conflict in the first place, dealing with those deep-seated fears and anxieties, finding a way for both sides to live together without constantly worrying about each other. That's a tall order.
It's a huge challenge, that's for sure. You've got decades of mistrust, different stories about what happened, and now all this death and destruction. How do you even begin to fix that?
It's definitely daunting, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. History's full of examples of conflicts that seemed impossible to solve, but then people found a way through dialogue and compromise. It takes courage, vision, and a willingness to see the other side as human beings. Those things can be hard to find in the middle of a war, but they're essential if we want to break the cycle of violence.
I really hope they can find those qualities. But right now, it feels like we're just stuck in this loop of escalation and uncertainty.
The uncertainty is definitely there, and it can be unsettling. But I think it's important to remember that even in the midst of all this chaos, we still have choices. The decisions made in the next few weeks and months will shape the future not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the whole world.
So what does that mean for our listeners? What can they do?
First of all, stay informed. Don't just skim the headlines or take sound bites at face value. Dig deeper, look for different perspectives, and question your own assumptions. The more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to make sense of all this.
And don't be afraid to have those tough conversations. Talk to your friends, your family, your community about what's happening. Share your thoughts, listen to others, and maybe we can start to build some understanding.
Beautifully said. And as you're processing all this information, remember the human cost of this conflict. Behind all the politics and military strategy, there are real people whose lives have been turned upside down. Their stories, their hopes, their fears. We should keep those in mind as we try to understand this conflict and find a way to peace.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's been a heavy topic, but hopefully you've gained a better understanding of what's going on. And if this episode has sparked your interest, go do some more research on your own. Read different perspectives, challenge your own biases, and form your own informed opinions.
Remember, knowledge is power, especially in times like these. Stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the issues that matter. Until then, take care, and thanks for listening.